All right. Well, first of all, I just wanted to thank the governor and your team for inviting me to this fireside chat today. It's a real honor and a privilege, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation. Now, what I'm excited about our fireside chat, what we're going to talk about today, is we're going to talk all things energy. And we're going to reflect a bit on what we've heard over the past couple of days. And I'm really interested in hearing your perspective, because I think it was Tuesday morning that you shared with us, like, it's an opportunity for us all to come out of the conference with new insights that we didn't have coming in from the conference, and I think it's a great time to discuss that. We've been hearing, and many of us have heard this for the past multiple years, that we're facing unprecedented change and uncertainty right now in our energy markets. We have shocks going on in the system with obviously what's happened in Ukraine, underinvestment in the oil and gas sector, emerging energy security issues, and all of this against the backdrop of decarbonization pressures and new legislation coming out of Washington, which has really created amazing momentum and unprecedented uncertainty that we haven't seen. And what is exciting for me, and this is what I've taken away from the past 2 days, is that this is Alaska's moment. And I would love to get your reflections on this, and really what your ambitions are, Governor, for the state across all things energy, and what it's going to take for you to meet your goals. So now is my time to introduce the governor, and I'm not going to be redundant of others.
Thank you.
But I wanted to highlight a few things. As many of you know, the governor is from Scranton, Pennsylvania, which is Appalachia coal country. And last week, when the governor and I were preparing for our discussion today, we talked about that, and we discussed our similar backgrounds. I'm also from Western Pennsylvania, and my family roots are also in Pennsylvania coal country, as my ancestors from Europe came over to work in the coal mines. And we spoke about our experiences in Appalachia and the poor in the state and that part of the state, but also how cheap energy was an element of that environment, and how that influenced your desire to focus on energy and the opportunity to make lives better in the state of Alaska. And obviously you did that as an educator in the state and the Northwest Arctic communities. And now you and I discussed that one of your most important goals is to make energy as cheap as possible for the poorest of the poor. So I wanted to highlight that. And the other thing I wanted to highlight is, and coming from Texas, where we all think everything's big and bold and we're all energy in Texas, but I have to say that the unprecedented legislation that you have been bringing to this state, I've been blown away. Whether we're talking about the record decision on Willow, the Pikka project, yesterday your signing of that legislation, Senate Bill 48, and putting AK LNG on the map as a strategic asset, if we want to use Ambassador Emanuel's terms. All I can say is wow. So to anchor our discussion today, Governor, and by the way, you can feel free to edit anything that I got wrong in that introduction. But I wanted to start off with what your vision is for the state of Alaska. Where do you want to see the state in 10, 20 years from now?
No, thank you, and thanks for being here. And I want to do a shout out to any and all of our legislators that might be here today, and those that aren't, to thank you for getting behind the carbon bill. I think it's going to be an incredible opportunity for the state of Alaska. We're going to work together to see where it goes, and the scale for Alaska to get on the world market is going to be it's unprecedented. So I want to thank the legislators for taking a risk, and that's really what Alaska has been all about. Alaska's always been about a risk. When Seward bought us, I think we're the only state in the country that reveres a Secretary of State. Everywhere you go, you'll see a picture of Seward. We have Seward's Day. We have the city of Seward. We have Seward Peninsula, and people are always like, who's Seward? Every time they come into the mansion, there's a portrait in the library in the mansion of Seward, and that's part of the quiz for people to start their conversation. I'll say, who's that on the wall? Because to us, Seward's vision. You got to remember, this is back in 1867. We're at the top of the world, right? They called it Walrussia, Icebergia. They made fun of it. Barely passed Congress for the purchase. But Seward's vision was, in a way, what we're experiencing today, and what Alaska will be for the next 50 years. And so that's what I'm looking at. The legislature's looking at. How do you create an Alaska for the next 50 years? And a lot of that comes from, as you were talking about our backgrounds, where we came from. I came from Scranton, Pennsylvania. There's another guy that's in office from Scranton. I'm trying to remember his name. I'm kidding. President Biden's from Scranton. We grew up heating with coal. We grew up where our grandparents all worked in the mines. I mean, that was part of our DNA. And the reason I bring that up is because coal was cheap. And for a family whose father was a mailman, mother was a clerk, we didn't make a lot of money. There were 4 boys in the family, small house. It meant the world. I mean, they were pinching pennies. They were counting dimes. And that cheap energy kept us warm, heated our water, et cetera. And as I mentioned yesterday, when I went out to rural Alaska in the early 80s, I was stunned at the cost of energy in rural Alaska. And it was $2.25 a gallon in rural Alaska, when I think it was 60 cents a gallon down south. And so immediately you're struck with how are people going to progress? How are they going to have hope and opportunity if they're saddled with high energy costs? So that began the journey for me to try and understand, how does Alaska fit in this energy world? Because it's a bit of a contradiction, right? We are an energy giant. We have the super giant here in North America called the North Slope. 2 million barrels per day back in 1990, 1989. I mean, just enormous. 500,000 barrels still going through the line today. But it was difficult for us internally to be able to capitalize on this energy because of scale. We only have 730,000 people in the state. And distance. We used to have 4 time zones before, I think it was 1980 or 81 here in Alaska. We're huge. So the journey has been how to provide cheap energy, consistent energy, sustainable energy for the people of Alaska, and provide energy for the world. And I think because of these new technologies, some of the action by Congress, what's happening on the world stage has really come together for Alaska right now. As I tell people, as you sit in here in this room, right out the window is Cook Inlet. Within 50 miles of this building, there's enormous geothermal capability, tides, onshore, offshore wind, oil, gas, coal, the list goes on within 50 miles. And so the question is going to be for us is, how do we harness it, by what means, and how do we use that to drive down the cost of energy and then bring industry here and create a standard of living for our kids and grandkids that we can be proud of.
I love that vision, and also how you think about how it maps back to the early days of Alaska and the challenges. I want to kind of pivot a little bit to what we've been hearing over the past couple of days, and you think about the vision and what you see in front of you for developing Alaska's energy economy and what it stands for, not just here but also globally. What have you taken away from the past couple of days that are going to help you kind of think about how to push and accelerate that transition for the state of Alaska? Yeah,
it's a very good question. And for me, the takeaway is more of a confirmation. That is, in Alaska, we appear to know more about the rest of the United States than many in the United States know about Alaska. We pay attention more to world markets on oil, for example. We pay attention to things that are happening in Asia and other places. I think more so than our compadres in the lower 48 do. And so I think for a long time, many of us, including myself, had this notion that, well, everybody knows about Alaska. It's not just a pretty place. It's not just a big place. It's not a place just to go fishing or go visit. But they know about all of our resource capabilities. But the fact of the matter is a lot of folks don't. And that was one of the reasons why we started this conference, was to highlight Alaska. So the takeaway for me is, even today when I'm speaking to investors, I'm speaking to innovators, I'm speaking to participants, and we talk about Alaska, a lot of the takeaway I'm getting is their takeaway, and they're saying, I didn't know that. I didn't realize that. I didn't know that you had this energy potential. Didn't know that you had all these trees. Didn't know that this was going to happen. So what I am really excited about is, I think when folks leave this conference, they're going to go away saying, and especially investors and others and innovators, put Alaska on the map. And by the way, we're not down by Mexico, all right? That's a Texas trick. They're the guys who do the maps, but ever since we became a state, they're jealous because they're no longer the largest state in the country, so they put us down by Mexico. Anyway, they're going to put us on the map. And that to me is part of that opportunity, that hope, and what's going to help drive Alaska policies for the next 50 years.
Yeah. I have to say I had a similar response, and I'm one of those, that came up to the state and have been really blown away. So we're going to talk about all things energy. So I'm going to start with conventional oil and gas. You had a recent record of decision on Willow. Congratulations.
Yeah.
That means a lot to the state. And I would love to hear you talk about a little bit about the benefits of Willow. What will it bring to the state? How do you see Willow, being part of this future?
Yeah, fantastic. So to lead into that, I'll tell you a story. Several years ago, my wife and my mother-in-law were making me a hunting park. And my wife and my mother-in-law were from the village of Norvik on the Kobuk River, way up there. And I remember asking my mother, I said, Mom, what was it like in the good old days? And she proceeded to tell me, she actually said the good old days, meaning, and when she started to talk, she talked about how energy was wood. You could barely afford fuel oil. The kids would use the cloth out of the old flour barrels to make clothing, the sack bags. She went on and on and on, and pretty quick you realize what she's really saying is how oil has transformed their lives. We talked earlier about the poorest of the poor, and I don't mean that in a disparaging way. I mean, we weren't very rich in Scranton either, but here you had our Native Alaskan people, the toughest people on the face of the earth, masters of their own universe for so long. And as they were transitioning, with the advent of the Western world coming here and trying to make a go of it, she was saying, basically, without oil, we wouldn't have hospitals like we do, clinics like we do, airports like we do, schools like we do. All of the things we take for granted to some degree in the state of Alaska was a result of oil. That was the commodity that built the state. And so I think for a lot of us, we're always going to be grateful for oil. We were thrilled about the Willow project. The vast majority of Alaskans, we believe that we have a long future in oil and gas as well. But that's just the tip of the iceberg.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, talking about the tip of the iceberg, and I mentioned this a little bit in my opening, you have been very active on the legislative front in passing bills to support your vision. And I'd love for you to, share with us a little bit about your vision for stable and secure energy markets in the state and some of the legislation you've passed or that you have introduced and how that supports your vision.
Well, again, there's two prongs to energy in the state of Alaska. One is to make sure that internally we have cheap, consistent, reliable energy. I'm having conversations with utilities constantly. I'm having conversations with energy producers constantly for the in-state aspect. But it's also to make sure that we can continually provide energy to the world. And this is another aspect that I think Alaska has to offer the world. If you produce energy here, you can be assured, as Jason was saying and others this morning, you can be assured that it's going to be produced to the highest standards. You can't be assured in other countries. There was an old saying, I don't know how much truth to it was, but that at one time our neighbors to the west, and the neighbors to the west is Russia, some of the engineers would talk about our pipeline and ask the question, this could be, like I said, this could be a little embellished story, but basically how much oil goes into the pipeline at Prudhoe Bay? And our engineers would tell them how much, and then they would say, how much comes out? And our engineers were like, what are you talking about? Because the idea was that along the way, you're going to lose oil through leakage. It's going to be leaked here or leaked there. We don't do that in Alaska. And if you ever have the opportunity to get up to Prudhoe Bay where they do the operations, it's incredible. You park a car, there's an absorbent pad put under, a vehicle, a truck, there's an absorbent pad put under that vehicle. We take taking care of the environment probably better than most think about the environment here in Alaska. So by producing here, we help the world with energy. By producing here, we don't necessarily underwrite some regimes and outfits that do child labor and maybe persecute their minorities. By doing it here, we provide the revenue for our people to lift them out of poverty. So energy production is the key, but in Alaska, again, there's two prongs to it: internal energy and exporting our energy as well.
Yeah. So staying a little bit on internal Alaska, there are different parts of the state, and you were educating me on the rail belt and the Aleutian Islands and the rural communities where you see energy costs at 70 cents a kilowatt hour, what have you. What is your vision for how in an all of the above approach you'll see? How do you see the future for each of those regions of Alaska and what you would like to see that energy economy look like?
Well, no, great question. So again, we also put together an energy task force made up of Alaskans and stakeholders to really examine the areas of Alaska. And if you divide Alaska into 3 areas, let's say the rail belt, which the vast majority of people live on, that's from Homer, Kenai Peninsula, up to Fairbanks, roughly 500,000 people, let's say. And then you divide it into southeast and coastal Alaska, and then the rest of Alaska, rural Alaska. You're able to take a look at what are some of the ways we can produce energy. What are some of the ways we can transmit energy? So for example, in southeast Alaska, as well as the Gulf Coast and going out to the Aleutians, we have hydro. Kodiak, for example, does a combination of wind and hydro, and they're basically 100% renewable right now. Southeast Alaska has a lot of hydro. The Aleutians have hydro, but also some incredible geothermal potential that I think is going to be realized here shortly. When you look at the rail belt, just outside the door, like we said, tidal, geothermal, biomass, oil, gas, coal, incredible. And in rural Alaska, you know, we're going to be mapping and making sure that we know what the resources are out there in terms of wind speeds, wind consistency, the potential for solar days, hydro in some aspects of rural and western Alaska as well. We think there's tremendous opportunity out there as well to provide localized energy. And Alaska leads the world, I believe, in microgrids. We're going to continue with that process, but we're going to employ the technologies and the types of energy that really are well suited for that locale. What's going to happen out in ADAC may be different what's going to happen up in Fort Yukon in terms of energy production. So it's such a big state with so much opportunity, but at the same time, we got to make sure that the energy production and distribution fits for the local, the locale that we're talking about.
Thank you. And I'm real time looking at questions as well. And one of the questions is, when will we see the results of the transition report that's due to be coming out?
I'm trying to remember.
The task force report. Right?
Oh, task force.
Yeah.
The task force is still going on. It's going to be meeting here this summer into the fall. And then what we want to do is get those recommendations so we can turn those recommendations into policies, regulations, and so forth to bring forth to the legislature for discussion.
Great, great. So now we're going to talk about LNG, which I feel like we've heard a lot about over the past few days. And one thing, again, one of my takeaways was thinking about LNG, and certainly in Alaska, not just as a resource, but as a strategic asset that Ambassador Emanuel talked about. And obviously as a bridge fuel, which we used to talk about natural gas as a bridge fuel 10, 15 years ago. Now we're bringing it back, which I think is the right answer. Our McKinsey analysis indicates that Alaska LNG has the potential to be more competitive than U.S. Gulf Coast LNG from a shipping standpoint, but also from an emissions intensity standpoint, which is increasingly on the minds of investors and many others. We've talked about the role that Alaska can play to supply the world. Would like to hear your perspective on that, but also the role that it will play in the foundation for the state as well.
It'll be huge. It'll be a game changer, just like the oil pipeline was in the 70s. You know, I think a lot of folks don't realize that Alaska was a pioneer in LNG export. We pioneered it for the United States of America, out of Cook Inlet right here. We were sending gas over to the Japanese starting in the late 60s. That lasted about 50 years until the volume of gas began to drop here in the inlet. But nonetheless, we established those ties with the Japanese. I mean, we had a resource, they had a need. We became, I think, incredible partners over that 50 years. Well, now with the possibility of gas coming from the slope, those partnerships are being revived. That, coupled with what's happened worldwide, the geopolitics, the changing view of fossil fuels and what is going to be a base fuel, et cetera, I think puts Alaska in the driver's seat. So, I mean, when you think about it, we're only about 8 days from Japan in terms of shipping. That's shorter than any other locale that has gas by far. The shipping lanes, as Ambassador Emanuel said, are not necessarily dangerous lanes. You're not going through the Malaccan Straits. You're not trying to work your way up through other countries. It's a straight shot from this sovereign, Alaska, to Tokyo. And so that, coupled with our capability to sequester carbon, which we believe is unmatched, unparalleled in terms of any other state, with our basins, our trees, our bogs, our peat, our coastline, really, I think, bodes well for the ability for us to provide energy, to also manage carbon, to strengthen our North Pacific alliance. And Alaska is a North Pacific state as well as an Arctic state. To do all those things, we have the ability and the resources to do it. We have the locale to do it. And I think what's happening on the world stage, I think that's all going to come together here, I hope, sooner than later, to be able to market that gas and help our allies in East Asia.
Yeah. Well, getting back to carbon management that you'd mentioned, I think this is a huge opportunity and a challenge for us in the transition, and I think a lot about it. I work with my clients a lot on carbon management. And I've been just flabbergasted, frankly, by the potential in this state. We estimate at McKinsey 200 gigatons of storage capacity.
It's enormous.
That's 4 times the current emissions globally. So think about the potential for Alaska.
I do every day. That's the whole idea. That's why you're here.
I'm thinking about the potential for Alaska. My wheels have been turning all the past few days. In SB 48, it addresses, I think, a really critical challenge that we see in other states, which is the framework for Class 6 wells, primacy. That's been stopping a lot of projects, I think, from going in other parts of the U.S. So what's next to attract investors to really take advantage of what you have in the potential here?
Well, that bill that was signed yesterday is huge, obviously. Investors here today, hearing this conversation, networking with others and understanding what Alaska's trying to do. We believe we can be a world player on the world stage. I mean, we're small in terms of population, but again, our location, our resources, as Seward recognized. I always brag on our state motto, right? You guys know what it is? Very good. Now, from the folks from other states, I'm not going to ask you what your motto is because sometimes you don't even know what your motto is. But Alaska, it's north of the future. And so the whole idea is to open this world up called Alaska to have people look beyond the fact that it's a beautiful place to visit, which it is. It's great for tourism, which it is. It's an amazing fishing state. I mean, we lead the country with a lot of ports in fishing here in Alaska. But we are the solution to the green economy. We have most of your rare elements here in the state of Alaska. The ability to do mining here and then help underwrite aspects of that new green economy are enormous. We've talked about oil, we've talked about gas, second largest tides. I mean, the list goes on. But what we need is investors to understand Alaska. The interesting thing about Alaska, and I was talking to a couple investors, and I'm not sure everyone knows this, but Alaska is unique amongst all the states for 2 reasons. One is that when we became a state, it is part of our agreement with the federal government in the 50s, we had to agree to collectivize all of our resources under the sovereign. So Alaska is more akin to a European sovereign than many of our other states like Texas, where the landowner owns the land, owns the mineral rights, et cetera. It's not the case in Alaska. But that also means that if you're an investor, you really just have to talk to the state of Alaska if you're doing business on state land. Our native corporations, which, by the way, I want to do a shout out to our native corporations, incredibly robust native corporations, I mean, that have helped tremendously in lifting their shareholders out of poverty, are also large landowners here in the state as well as the feds. But we own the resources under the sovereign. And the other interesting thing about Alaska is it's the most unified executive in the country by constitution. The governor gets elected, the governor appoints his commissioners with the approval of the legislature, but we get to appoint. They don't run for office. The Attorney General doesn't run for office. The head of DNR doesn't run for office. Our Education Commissioner doesn't run for office. We choose those people. They are then confirmed by the legislature. And so it makes it easier in some respects if you're going to do business in Alaska, because you're not having to deal with 100 different landowners on one resource in one basin. And so when it comes to, for example, sequestering carbon, there won't be a lot of landowners per se in court for long periods of time figuring out whose basin that is. It's pretty limited here in the state of Alaska.
Yeah, and I think that's incredibly interesting that you have that situation here, because that is where really the unlocks that I think investors are looking for is how can you think through ways to easily be able to invest in carbon management. So thank you for sharing that. I think those in the room were learning quite a bit. Now I want to kind of turn to the unlocks. So we've talked about a lot about the potential and some of the unlocks, like as you mentioned, the legislation you just passed. And we're all amongst friends here, but I'd like to turn to federal policy and permitting and where the unlocks are for how you could even do more if you were to address some of the federal challenges particularly on permitting?
Yeah, we've talked about this. I've talked with some of the federal folks that were here yesterday. Alaska is, we feel we're in a situation where the promise of statehood, the promise, and really at the time in the 50s, it was a mandate for us to develop our resources to pay for ourselves. That's the irony, is being somewhat throttled by some of the agencies and some of the attitudes in some of the agencies. I mean, currently I believe we have about 51 actions against Alaska to stop a number of different projects by the federal government. However, again, what I see is, I don't want, maybe the term is softening, but a changing attitude that not only if you do the development in Alaska will be done better than in other countries if you truly are concerned about the environment, but from a national security aspect, it makes total sense to do mining, looking for your strategic metals and elements, et cetera, probably timber as well, certainly oil and gas. You're better off, the country is better off, our national security is better off, our neighbors, our allies, the environment is better off if we do it here. I think you're starting to see a softening of that. We'll see how that really translates into permitting processes, how quickly. We'll see how, we'll see if that's going to change the somewhat, some tension, this tension that we have with the federal government on trying to capitalize on our resources.
Yeah.
We're hoping this conference adds to that and hopes, we hope that we can mitigate some of that from the agencies.
And on mining, and there was actually a question from the audience around critical minerals. And the question is, if we want to have critical minerals development in the state, we need to incentivize exploration. Do you have any thoughts on this, how we can incentivize exploration in the state? Yeah,
we have conversations, and we're gonna have, I think, a session here with some of the concerns on mining as well today. But certainly Alaska is a huge state, so energy to be able to actually do the mining, be part of the mining operation, as well as infrastructure, which means roads. So for example, we're working on a road process for what we call the Ambler Mining District, which is north of Fairbanks and out west, and able to access some incredible finds out there that could help with what we're doing with our future economies. We're having discussions on how the state can be part of that road system, how we help to some degree underwrite that road system. The Red Dog Mine, one of the largest lead zinc mines in the world, is located in northwest Alaska. One of our agencies, our ADA agency, it's a state-sanctioned agency, they helped develop the road from the mine to the port back in the 80s and came up with a process in which that mine was a toll road. So that partnership enabled the mine to be able to get its ore down to the port and ship it out at the port, with a partnership with the state agency in which there's a toll paid on that road, and it's pretty close to being paid off. So we are open and we are interested in having those conversations when it comes to infrastructure assistance, and because of the changing technologies in energy, we think there's a tremendous opportunity here in Alaska to capitalize on some of the energy technologies we're talking about to be able to help the mining plays land on that energy source that's going to be able to help them do their exploration development and getting that ore shipped out.
Thank you. And kind of shifting now to the renewables, geothermal, offshore wind, and there's definitely a number of questions from the audience as well on these. We have a ton of funding from the seminal IRA legislation in Washington that's designed to support these types of technologies. What is Alaska doing to attract some of those funds, and where do you see the future for some of these new technologies? Yeah,
we have an office dedicated totally to coordinating the different funding initiatives that have come out over the last 2 years through this administration with regard to new energy, new technologies, storage, transmission, generation, et cetera. So we do have somebody right now actually coordinating that to make sure that we can offer up and have discussions with investors on how we can scaffold or layer different types of tax credits or incentive programs so that we can lower that cost and make it more of an incentive to actually do business here. We've been having discussions, for example, on our agricultural projects with investors where if they're looking at potentially growing crops, canola, for example, for oil, that there might be a possibility for a tax credit for biodiesel. And then at the same time, a tax credit for certain types of renewable energies to dry that crop and to process that crop. And so we're getting into some really deep conversations, I think, with some potential investors to coordinate not just what's happening in the federal government, but also the private investment. Because as was mentioned this morning, which I think was, I mean, that was another one of my takeaways, is because of these programs that the federal government is doing, a lot of private investment is also looking at America, because by doubling down on some of these programs, it's a way to invest and get a potentially terrific return. So here in Alaska, we are part of America. As I say to folks, we're America and so much more. I think in some ways, well, better, but don't quote me on that. We're going to work hard at working with investors to see what we can do in that area as well. In other words, capitalizing on these programs that the federal government has put together.
Yeah. And another question I have, and there's some audience questions as well around this. We talk a lot about development and development of energy assets and resources. There's also, I think, a really important part of the transition in energy security, which is around supply chain and siting manufacturing facilities. What's your vision for that in the state of Alaska, and where do you see the first opportunities? Is it in nuclear? Is it in offshore wind? Where do you see the opportunity?
I mean, we're realistic, right? When you start a project today, whether it's a pursuit of small nuclear technology, geothermal, tidal, a lot of those technologies are evolving. A lot of those technologies are for example, tidal would be specific to certain places on the globe, and Alaska is one of them. But at the same time, when we're pursuing research and hopefully the application of technologies in those areas, we have tremendous biomass possibilities here in the state of Alaska. 43 million acres of trees that could also be put to use, not just for creating opportunities for cheap lumber in the state of Alaska, but also for electrical generation. Also for, I mean, there's tax credits to use that waste in the wood processing for synthetic fuels. So I would say that once again, it's going to be a multi-pronged approach to how we do this and how we land on it. But again, in some respects, Alaska is behind the times because we have focused tremendously on oil and gas over the decades. And because of what's happening worldwide, because of what's happening in Washington, because of what's happening with the whole carbon concerns internationally as well, these technologies are now being made available, and what we have to offer in Alaska, I think, is a tremendous opportunity to avail ourselves internally for our people these technologies, whether it's wind, onshore, offshore, like we talked about, biomass, and capitalizing on our gas opportunities internally as well.
Mm-hmm. One other unlock that we talk about in other states, and also just in the U.S. in general, is talent, and having the talent to turn those technology ideas into action. You're going to need a lot of it in the state. What is your thinking around education and talent development for the new energy economy?
Yeah, no, great question. So we have a university that was established back around 1917. It was a land grant university for agriculture and mining. And I think it does a terrific job. They have a number of programs. My daughter just graduated with her mining engineering degree program here in May. She'll be working at Red Dog Mine. But they have a number of programs. ANSEP, which is a program that focused originally on Native Alaskans, getting Native Alaskans into the mining industry, is an excellent program. And so you're going to see more discussions with our legislature on how we do exactly what you're saying, because it's not just going to be mining, which we need to, I think, increase our graduates in the field that affects mining, but also how do we train people up to deal with the renewable technologies that we're looking at? Because again, if we do this right in Alaska, it just won't be one application statewide. There's going to be different sources of energy, different types of transmission, and so we're going to have to train our people up here in the state of Alaska. We're going to have to work with our university. We're going to have to work with our unions, et cetera, to make sure that we have folks ready for this new transition to help us get there. So those discussions are happening. Those discussions will continue to happen, and we're going to capitalize on any sources of funding to assist with that as well.
You just triggered the thought of a technology we haven't yet talked about, which is hydrogen. And what triggered my thought is that what we are seeing in some of the larger LNG companies around the world is that a lot of that engineering technology talent is very transferable between liquefied natural gas production and regasification and hydrogen development. And so I'm wondering also if you could talk a little bit about hydrogen and how that plays into the state, because I think it's a big opportunity.
Yeah, I think our location on the globe, once again, could help with our Asian allies in that area as well. And again, when we're talking about, if we're talking about blue hydrogen, we've got the capability of doing that with our gas, obviously. We knock off the carbon and we sequester that in the basin. We have an ammonia plant that is now pickled in Cook Inlet, but you can convert your hydrogen to be able to carry it in a physical manner, a solid manner, with ammonia on ships to places like Japan and Korea for them to put in their coal-fired plants. We have the capability, if the technologies are proven up, for example, in our tidal energy, for energy to crack water into green hydrogen. Same with wind, same with geothermal. So I can imagine a number of different tracks working at once to unleash the ability for the state to be a hydrogen producer. It was interesting. We were in a meeting several months ago, a staff member and myself down south, and there was a discussion amongst Western states about being a leader, a hydrogen hub. What was interesting is, they talked about the only impediment was that it requires a tremendous amount of fresh water. Yeah. And if we know what's happening in the West, that's a commodity that's going to be difficult to come by. The state of Alaska has 3 times the amount of fresh water of any other state in the country, by far. And so we have all of the resources here in Alaska. We have the location here in Alaska. Again, we just got to pull it together, pull together the investors, the resource owners, and the buyers of these products to actually start to put things into play on a large scale, including hydrogen.
Yeah. And, on that note, and I think I have 2 more questions for you because we're almost at time. One question is kind of as you think about pulling that all together, in addition to developing talent and, locally, how do you attract companies to the state and additional talent to come in and really develop these energy economies? Because it's going to take a lot to get there. Yeah,
and that's part of the exciting part about this conference and other conferences we're going to, because we're sitting down and having meetings. I've had meetings with some of the folks in here today, having them tell us as investors what do they see are the opportunities here in Alaska, and then what do they see are potential barriers that we need to take a look at, both from the executive point of view, but also with our legislature, in partnership with our legislature. So that's part of what I'm hoping to get out of this, is that investors say to us, there's tremendous opportunity here, there's no doubt about it. Your resources are terrific. In order for us to get investors here, maybe we do a tweak here, maybe we get guaranteed amounts of water to do this, maybe we look at how we put together land deals to be able to set down processing plants or manufacturing plants or energy plants. Those are the discussions that I'm actually excited about. How do we get Alaska ready for the investments for the next 50 years to transform Alaska for the next 50 years, for the next generations going into the next 50 years?
Yeah. And have you heard any unlocks or challenges?
Yeah, actually we have. And it depends on what you're looking at. If it's agriculture, we've had certain discussions around agriculture. If it's wind and generation, we're having certain discussions around wind and generation. And this will involve, obviously, our utilities, both on the rail belt and in rural parts of Alaska. But pretty, I think, exciting conversations and really doable. Alaska has the natural resource. We just have to make sure that our policies, our laws, our regulations, et cetera, match up with our vision on where we want to go, what we want to do with these resources.
Yeah. And on that kind of note around, how can you incentivize, how are investors, in your conversations over the past couple of days with investors, how are they forming? And, what's it going to take for investors to really, come to Alaska, the ones that haven't yet been here that are maybe thinking about it?
No, it's a great question. So, obviously, the investors I've talked to see Alaska as we're America. So there's a certain amount of de-risking when you're doing business in America, just because of our jurisprudence and our legal system. But now with these programs coming out of the federal government, some real opportunities, not just for investors here in America, but investors overseas looking at America, because of those programs. But again, the discussions are going to be, to some degree, in their boardrooms too. And it'll be different types of investors. Is it short-term, high risk? Is it going to be long-term? Returns may not be double digits, but may be a steady return. I think Alaska affords the possibility for a whole host of different types of investments, and quite honestly, co-investments. As I mentioned, if you're doing an agricultural project in the state of Alaska, for example, we have a 145,000-acre ag project we just opened up. It's never had a chemical on it. It's never had a pesticide on it. Tremendous amounts of water, terrific soil. You'll probably have discussions with outfits. We'll probably have discussions with outfits that will say, hey, we can grow this, like I said earlier, and get a biofuel credit. We'll be able to market this and brand this as Alaska grown or chemical free. We'll be able to do that with renewable energy that we can get a tax credit on. And so, again, just envisioning what we have to offer and partnering with investors that are also thinking about, again, is it a long-term investment that's a safe investment, maybe a lower return? Is it a short-term investment? Those are also the discussions that we're having, and I want to have more of those discussions, actually.
Well, I have one last question for you, but before I ask you the question, I just want to comment that I think this has been a phenomenal discussion about bringing it all together. The past few days, hearing your insights of what you've learned and kind of what is it going to take your vision and really make it a reality, whether it be policy, unlocking, federal permitting, bringing investors and other corporations to the state. So I'm excited for what you have in front of you. And that kind of leads into my last question, which is, if you were to look back 5 years from now, what do you really want to make sure you've accomplished when it comes to the energy economy in Alaska?
I think the bill that was signed yesterday, and again with the legislature, 58 votes out of a 60-member legislature, I think is telling. And I think continuing that work with our legislature to come together and identify what are the potential hurdles for Alaska to get to where we want to go. I think if we get the legal framework in place, and I think to be honest with you, we have pretty much it all in place now, but some tweaking. And then, again, getting investment defined, paper signed, and in process to build. I mean, I'll be gone here in 3 years, right? I mean, these jobs go pretty quick. But if we can get that in place, and the promise and the hope of lower energy costs for Alaskans, consistent energy costs for Alaskans, we get our carbon approach to carbon mapped out so that we're a world leader. We get more mining activity occurring in Alaska so that we can help the world, the United States, be more secure. We get our gas line going so that our Asian allies for the next 50 years, if not longer, can feel secure that they have a partnership with America and don't have to worry about partnering with other regimes that may not be reliable. If we can just get those things in place and point it in the right direction, I think we would have accomplished a tremendous amount for the state of Alaska and for America and for our Asian allies.
Well, with that, I think we have to end the discussion. That's a pretty amazing outlook that you have for the state. Thank you very much, Governor. Really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for having me.